Hi everyone, my name is Ikra Keski and I work at Mesa County Libraries. Today I'm going to be talking about the Club Ranch, which was a large ranching operation on the west end of Montrose County. I first learned about the Club Ranch when I was doing some research on uranium mining south of Gateway. So that was my first introduction to the ranch itself. Thankfully, the Club Ranch is widely represented in historic newspaper articles. For a local ranch in western Colorado, we consider it actually to be heavily represented. So it was nice to be able to have those sources to rely upon as far as those newspaper articles. It's also, the ranch itself is also mentioned quite frequently in books dealing about local history. And I'll have a reference slide at the end of this presentation with some of those titles. Established in the late 19th century, the Club Ranch was also known as the San Miguel Cattle Company. It was located 15 miles northwest of Natarita along the San Miguel River. Part of the initial investment money actually came from R.W. Johnson of the Johnson & Johnson Medical Supply Company. And at the beginning of the 20th century, estimates on the side of the herd ranged from 2,500 to 3,500 head of cattle. The number of cattle in that herd might have been even larger prior to that. The name of the ranch came from the brand, which was shaped like a club and a deck of cards. Club Mesa and nearby mines were named after the ranch. In fact, one of those mines was actually named the Club Sandwich Mine. The ranch was quite well known in western Colorado and probably in eastern Utah. In fact, the November 29th, 1915 issue of the Montrose Enterprise included a listing of a nearby stock ranch that was up for sale and that the property was located 8 miles east of the, quote, celebrated Club Ranch, end quote. This next slide is a photo from around 1921 of the Joe Jr. Mill and Camp, which was located just upriver from the main properties of the ranch. The site of the mill would eventually come to be more well known as the mining town of Uravan. The next slide is from a 1922 USGS topographical map, and we can see the ranch listed on the right, towards the right center of that image. The next slide is portions of the USGS topographical maps from 1950 and 1960, and we can see the Club Ranch shown towards the left center of that image. However, by 1965, those historical USGS topo maps no longer show the ranch. Although based on knowing where Uravan is, we can see Uravan on the map right there along the San Miguel. We know basically where the ranch was located. The May 21st, 2015 issue of the San Miguel Basin Forum included an interview with a man named Paul Campbell. And Paul Campbell's father, Pete Campbell, had worked on the ranch along with other nearby cattle operations. Campbell mentions that the ranch had initially gotten its start as the Club Camp, which was located along the nearby Tabawatch Creek. Paul Campbell also describes that an orchard was located at the ranch. According to the book, Halfway Between Nobody Knows Where and Somebody's Starting Point, A History of the West End of Montrose County, Colorado, by John Hardcastle, the ranch was perhaps the most successful in the area. The book also describes the ranch headquarters as being splendidly located in a country all its own, encompassing 110 acres, and that the ranchers had access to summer grazing on the nearby Uncompahgre Plateau. The cattle were wintered between the San Miguel River Valley and Paradox Valley. And I definitely have to agree with the writer's description of that area. You know, you've got those beautiful sandstone walls, those beautiful sandstone canyons, other formations. You're also going to have the beautiful, I know I'm using the word beautiful a lot, but it is just a wonderful location. You've got the Dolores River, the San Miguel River. A little bit to the west, you've got Paradox Valley. And as you go across Paradox Valley, you're looking up towards the La Salle Mountains. So it's just a really wonderful setting. I'm sure it would have been a beautiful setting for a ranch in the late 19th century or early 20th century. There's a lot of fascinating history and prehistory in the area, and I think this ranch definitely falls under those lines. In 1881, a prospector by the last name of Kane had found a number of mining claims along the San Miguel River. At a later point, he had met another gentleman by the name of Dr. Durbin. And Kane mentioned to Dr. Durbin that the area where the club ranch would eventually be located would be ideal for a ranching operation. The two men ended up making a trip, and this led Durbin to buy Kane's placer mining locations, and Durbin then established the San Miguel Cattle Company, which was to be located at the ranch. Durbin was elected as the president of the cattle company, and he began to put cattle on the range and to work the nearby mining claims. In 1884, however, Dr. Durbin passed away, and R.W. Johnson became the new president of the cattle company. Under recommendation from experienced cattlemen, Johnson hired a gentleman by the name of Ed Wetzel to be the new foreman of the ranch. Wetzel would serve as the general manager of the ranch for 20 years, and eventually he bought the ranch from R.W. Johnson. Alex Calhoun and Bill Selby bought the ranch from Wetzel in 1906, and Calhoun would eventually buy out Selby's interest 5 years later. According to the July 23, 1987 issue of the San Miguel Basin Forum, Calhoun would later sell the ranch to men by the names of Butterfield and Christie. During the previously mentioned interview with Paul Campbell, Campbell describes that both Ed Wetzel and Alex Calhoun were instrumental in the many improvements which were made to the ranch, and that they both deserved much credit for the initial success of the operation. Born in 1854 in Ontario, Calhoun was apparently very well regarded and respected in the area. In fact, the Montrose Daily Press issue from December 10, 1912, described the purchase of the ranch that Calhoun had made from Selby. The article further described that an important part of the sale is that it would put an end to rumors that Calhoun was to close out his local business interests and relocate to South America. The article further reads, "The Calhoun brand of man is not too common, and we are inclined to the belief that South America can get along quite well without Alex Calhoun. We need him here." To me, it's obvious that Calhoun had made a favorable and deep impression on the people in the area. Ed Lavender was one of the later owners of the ranch. Lavender was a stepfather of the noted and well-known writer David Lavender. David had worked in the ranch in the 1920s and 1930s when Ed owned the operation. David Lavender's book, One Man's West, details some of the time that he spent while at the ranch. David Lavender also happened to be a historian, and he wrote over 40 books, several of those books focusing on the history of the West, including the titles The Southwest and also the title Bent's Fort. Lavender was nominated twice for the Pulitzer Prize, and in 1997 he received the Wallace Stegner Award from the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado. I've actually read both The Southwest and One Man's West, and I would highly recommend them. Just very detailed in the amount of research that went into those books. Highly recommended for anyone interested in history of Colorado and the Southwest. In One Man's West, Lavender describes the ranch as being 22 miles from the nearest electrical light and over 100 miles from the nearest competent doctor. He also described some of the mining activities that took place near the ranch and also the hanging flume, which is sometimes referred to as the San Miguel flume. Today, the flume is on the National Register of Historic Places. And Lavender mentions that he had written part of One Man's West on a desk made from repurposed wood from the hanging flume. The June 15th, 1977 issue of the San Miguel Basin Forum includes portions of an interview with a man named Veer Ray. Ray mentions that after the hanging flume had been abandoned, some of the barns and sheds at the ranch had been constructed with pieces of wood from the flume. Ray also describes that in 1977, the lone remains of the ranch was a fruit tree growing along Highway 141. So I would definitely say that the folks working at the ranch made use of that wood from the hanging flume. So they were definitely, industrious and resourceful people. Probably had a lot to do with the success of the operation as well. By 1890, there were almost 30,000 head of cattle in the area, and the railroad station at Placerville served the entire region, making it one of the largest scale cattle shipping operations in the United States. Placerville is located about 54 miles southeast of where the club ranch was located. This next slide is showing us a headline from an article in the January 14th, 1911 issue of the San Miguel Examiner describing mining activities near the club ranch. The ranch happened to be located near an early discovery of carnotite ore. That ore would prove to be important in the manufacture of radium, vanadium, and uranium. By 1913, the Standard Chemical Company purchased land near the base of Club Mesa. Thereafter, the small mining community of the Joe Jr. camp took root, eventually starting out as a small tent town which spread into the former alfalfa fields of the ranch. The Joe Jr. camp was abandoned in 1923, although it was later reopened. The February 2nd, 1936 issue of the Daily Sentinel reported that a DeBeck resident by the name of P.W. Palmer had purchased the ranch along with all of the livestock, equipment, range, and water rights. The town of Uravan was opened in 1936 and the mill began operations in 1949. And at that time, the main ranch house and hayfields were still in place. And Uravan was located just upriver from where the club ranch was located. According to the Colorado Historic Newspapers collection, the earliest mention of the ranch was from the June 18, 1898 issue of the Montrose Enterprise newspaper. The article described that haying operations would soon be starting at the ranch. The mention was included in a section of the newspaper titled Pinyon Points, and Pinyon was a nearby town located close to Nucla. The Colorado Historic Newspapers collection contains over 400 articles related to the ranch, and most of those articles are from the Montrose Daily Press, Telluride Daily Journal, Montrose Enterprise, San Miguel Examiner, and the Norwood Post. The last article related to the ranch in the Colorado Historic Newspapers collection was from March 27, 1925. The May 10, 1915 issue of the Montrose Enterprise made mention of a trip made by Montrose County Assessor G.W. Clark. Clark had traveled to the towns of Nucla and Natarita, as well as the Standard Chemical Company properties. The article also notes that he had visited the ranch and that he was shown a good time. The purpose of the assessor's trip was to look for taxable property, and it was written that he was well received by people in the area. In the 1940s, Raymond and Barbara Hutton had both lived at the ranch with their parents who were employed there. Raymond described taking loads of fresh meat, corn, and tomatoes to the nearby commissary store. He also mentions that the store owner always gave him a Nesbitt orange soda. Hutton describes a barter system that was used in the community during wartime. Both Barbara and Raymond fondly remembered living on the ranch as children, describing such memories as playing in the abandoned Stone Club house. The Hutton family eventually moved to nearby Uravan. In addition to Alex Calhoun, one of the more colorful and remembered cowboys at the ranch was a man by the name of Lou Locker. Locker had relocated to the San Miguel Valley from New York City in 1901 at the age of 19. And I would imagine, especially for someone who was so young, that there would have been a bit of a culture shock in moving from a big city to a small community in western Colorado. Nowadays, the San Miguel Basin is, somewhat remote, but back in 1901, it would have even been more remote. And in some ways, it would have been a frontier of the West. While on the East Coast, Locker had become a bicycle enthusiast, and he learned how to perform bike stunts and tricks. He performed those tricks and stunts in Grand Junction, Montrose, and the San Miguel country. Locker's last cycling performance was to ride a narrow section of the Colorado Cooperative Flume, which was over 3,000 feet long and 110 feet in height. He rode that entire flume. He was also a prospector and was heavily involved in building many of the San Miguel irrigation systems. Locker was also an early crusader against pollution in the area, and he often gave presentations on that issue. Coming up next, I just have a couple slides that I thought would be interesting to include. The next slide is of Lou Locker. Lou is standing on the bicycle towards the left side of the picture, and Lou's performing partner is actually standing on the opposite side on the right. The next slide is a photograph of the Colorado Cooperative Flume that was located near Nucla, and this is that flume that Locker rode the entire length of. And I can imagine how thrilling and exhilarating it would have been for Locker, and I can imagine how it also would have been thrilling and exhilarating for the folks watching the performance way down in the ground level. This next slide, is a branding scene on the Club Ranch Summer Range on the Uncompahgre Plateau. The next image is of a branding scene at the Club Ranch itself from around 1906. The next slide is, I think it's a great photo of some of the Club Ranch workers and some of their wives. The man holding the cat is Pete Campbell, and as we remember, Pete Campbell's son, Paul, had been interviewed in newspapers about the history of the ranch. Pete Campbell's wife is standing to the right of him. The photo was taken sometime between 1906 and 1915 while Alex Calhoun owned the ranch. The next slide is of the Club Ranch main house, taken between roughly 1936 to 1939. The next slide is showing us the ranch main buildings taken during that same time period. The next image is of the machine shop and poultry house at the ranch, once again taken during that time period from roughly 1936 to 1939. In One Man's West by David Lavender, the book that I mentioned earlier, Lavender describes the Club Ranch Winter Range as being on a craggy rectangular mesa thrusting up between the Paradox, the Dolores River, and the San Miguel River. And in this next slide, we have an aerial image of that area. We can see the San Miguel River flowing from the right side of the screen up towards the top. And we've got the Dolores River running from the left side of the screen up to the top. And we can see a tiny section of Paradox Valley there in the lower left-hand corner. So that would make that mesa that David Lavender was referring to as being somewhere towards the center of that image. It definitely looks to be craggy, as Lavender mentioned. A lot of elevation gain and loss. This next slide is from the Daily Sentinel on November 6, 1951. And it is a notice for an auction which was to be held at the Club Ranch. The next map is from the December 31st, 1972 issue of the Daily Sentinel, showing some of the locations of ranches in Mesa County and Montrose County. The Club Ranch is not on this map. By this time, the ranch had in ways been forgotten about, but it would have been located towards the lower left-hand corner of that map. And some of the nearby ranches at that time were the Hilke Ranch, the Gilbert Ranch, and the Musser Ranch. After World War II ended, one of the mining companies based out of Uravan purchased the historic ranch. And at times, employees at Uravan and sometimes their families would live in the Club Ranch main house. The December 14th, 1913 issue of the Montrose Enterprise described the ranch as such. The Club Ranch is the wayside inn, as it were, of a vast territory where the wonders of nature are abundant and supremely magnificent, but where the abodes of man are exceedingly few and far between. The Club Ranch is a landmark of Western Colorado. This next slide includes the references that I used. The first book was The Nature of Southwestern Colorado by Deborah Paulson and William Baker. Yellow Cake Towns by Michael Amundsen. One Man's West by David Lavender. Uncompahgre Country by Wilson Rockwell. And Frontier and Transition, A History of Southwestern Colorado by Paul O'Rourke. And I also have a link or a URL to another website that contains a lot of oral history interviews on the Uravan area. I'd also like to throw in the fact that all of those books that I just mentioned are available through Mesa County Libraries. All right, I hope that all of you enjoyed this presentation on the Club Ranch. I hope it was enjoyable, and I hope that it was also educational. I really enjoyed preparing for it and doing that research, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.